Today we're looking at bioaccumulation. And bioaccumulation is a big word, but it simply means things building up in living things. So think of the word bio, again, means living things, or biology is the study of living things. And accumulation means to build up. So we're building up things in a living thing. And this is a fancy word for describing the buildup of toxins in organisms in the environment. So we're going to look at a bunch of different examples of where this has happened. But if you think about just a natural ecosystem, we always have nutrients and things being cycled through that ecosystem. We've looked at the carbon cycle, the oxygen cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and even way back in middle school, you looked at the water cycle. So these chemicals and nutrients are naturally cycled through an ecosystem. So in a normal ecosystem, you have organisms born, they live, they reproduce, they die, and all the materials needed for that life cycle are also cycled through the ecosystem. But once humans appear into this ecosystem with all of our technology and industry and things like that, we end up producing chemicals to make whatever products we're using at the time, and other chemicals for things that we use in the household, like even just things like soaps and detergents and things, cleaning solutions and stuff like that. Those eventually get released into the environment somehow. And we even like take chemicals and we spread them deliberately on our lawns or on our crops to kill certain pests, rodents, even other weeds and things like that. So these different chemicals end up getting put into our environment. Now, if these poisons were not part of the ecosystem initially, so there's no way for the ecosystem to actually rid itself of these poisons. If there's no cycle to do this, what happens? How does the environment, or how does the ecosystem get rid of it? So we're going to look at what happens to these things after they're in our ecosystem or in our environment. So there's two words we have to learn. The first one is called biodegradable. And biodegradable means just that. It's living things that can break down, or things breaking down in the environment. So if we're looking at things that are able to be broken down naturally, these are usually things like human sewage, or even just waste from animals in the environment, food scraps, dead organisms. All of these things break down in the environment naturally. If you think of composting or water treatment plants, or like a septic field that takes all the waste food, the waste feces and manure and things, and breaks it back down so it's usable in the environment. But there are also non-biodegradable substances that are slowly broken down, or and we're talking extremely slowly, or they just never get broken down. Once they're in this ecosystem, they're basically there forever. And some examples are things like glass and plastic, mercury, lead, this DDT that we're going to talk more about in a second. These are chemicals that once they're in the ecosystem, they are there. Glass doesn't break down. You can smash it up into smaller pieces, but once you've made glass, you've made glass. It just exists. It's not going to break back down to the sand and silicates that it was once without some sort of intervention. Plastics, once they're made, they're there. And I mean, we see this in our oceans these days. There's tons and tons of plastic floating around in the ocean. So these pollutants will actually end up becoming toxins if they affect living organisms. So, plastic might not be a toxin just in the environment, but if something's ingesting that plastic, it could be a toxin. It could affect the life cycle of that organism. Mercury is a great example of something that is a toxin. So when these non-biodegradable substances get into our ecosystem, typically lots of them will be absorbed into water. Some of them will be just absorbed into the soil, or just floating around in the lakes and rivers and streams or oceans or whatever. But if you think about lots of these toxins, these chemicals, plants will take them up with water, and those chemicals end up accumulating in a plant a little bit. And what ends up happening though is since they can't be broken down, they get stored in that plant. And then a herbivore, primary consumer, will come along and eat that plant, and then it will eat that toxin. But the problem is the herbivore needs to eat a lot of plants to survive. So it's going to get a little bit from this plant, a little bit from this plant, a little bit from this plant, and all of those chemicals or end up getting stored in the fats inside that organism. So it actually, the primary consumer is going to get a buildup of that chemical because they're getting it from all the plants that they're eating. And then eventually the higher level consumers will also start to, they're going to eat more of your lower level consumers to survive. They're going to get more and more and more and more of that toxin. And it basically accumulates up the food chain, which is what we call bioaccumulation. Another word for it is bioamplification. You may even hear the word biomagnification. All words meaning getting bigger, growing, getting higher. So eventually, these levels of toxin can be high enough that the higher level consumers are going to have their health affected. They could be poisoned, they could die, they could have weakened immune systems, even just like uh, their adaptation to the environment might be weakened. So they might be more susceptible to disease, to the elements, to predators, and ultimately it's going to affect their population. So here's an example of this. In the 1940s, they were spraying this chemical called DDT onto all sorts of crops, mainly like wheat crops, to prevent insects infesting the crop and eating the crop and ruining the crop. So they sprayed it to control insects, but then about 10 to 20 years later, they started noticing the number of falcons and hawks and bald eagles, these top predator birds, their population, like they were almost like disappearing. There was almost like they weren't there. So what was happening? So they started looking into it. And if we think about the food chain, we go from wheat to grasshopper, from a grasshopper to a small bird, from a small bird to a large bird. As you go up the food chain, they found that this DDT levels in these higher carnivore birds, like the top predator birds, the DDT levels were really, really high. And it's because that DDT was working its way up the food chain. And if we look at it in this way, as this food chain, your wheat was sprayed with DDT, then the grasshoppers ate the wheat. Some of them died, but some of them survived. The secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and then the tertiary consumers, the falcons, eat the secondary consumers. So every time you're moving up the food chain, that amount of DDT in the organism was increasing. And this is kind of what it looks like here. So you can see, like if we're talking about an aquatic ecosystem, you would have a very small amount of DDT in the water. So not a lot, but then the zooplankton are getting a bit more in there. This is parts per trillion. Now we're into parts per million. But now the small fish are eating a lot of zooplankton. So the small fish would get an accumulation of DDT in their fat stores. And so now we're up to 0.5 parts per million. But then a large fish needs to eat lots of small fish to survive, so it gets even more. And then you get up to the raptors and to like the bald eagles and falcons and whatnot. They need to eat lots of larger fish to survive, so they're getting even more. So we're going from 2 parts per million to 25 parts per million. So that accumulation is happening, and it ended up having a very big effect and impact on the peregrine falcon and bald eagles in particular. So what we started noticing is that their population was nearly wiped out, and what ended up happening is the DDT actually caused the eggshells to become really thin, brittle, and what would happen is the mother eagle or falcon would sit on her eggs in the nest, and the eggs were too thin and too brittle that they would actually just break. So none of the eggs would ever hatch because the babies were born or died before they were even born. So not only that, there was another effect. The DDT seemed to have kind of a weird effect on their behavior, where the mother birds would not actually stick around to nurse the young, like to feed the young, or to stick around the nest and make sure that the chicks would survive. So there was some changes in behavior as well, and because of this, the population of these falcons decreased significantly, and eagles as well. Now, DDT was banned since 1969, and since then, these levels have dropped. There is still DDT in these organisms and in the ecosystem, but we're seeing a very good drop in these levels and a very good increase in the populations of these birds. So by banning this chemical, we've seemed to maybe not quite completely reverse the trend, but we've stopped it and it's improving again. So we can fix these problems, but We just have to make sure that we're on top of it. Now, I'm going to show a video at this point of DDT in the environment, and they're going to kind of go through what actually happened here.
This week on Earth Tones, we're looking at some of the environmental advances that affect our daily lives. Tonight, a development with an unexpectedly negative and lingering impact on Earth.
At one time, DDT was probably the most commonly used pesticide in North America. By the early 70s, more than 1 billion kilograms had been released into the environment. DDT was so popular because it's a one-size-fits-all pesticide that kills many different kinds of bugs. But DDT doesn't just kill bugs, it's harmful to all kinds of creatures, especially birds.
DDT affected the eggshell on birds. Normal eggshells are quite thick. The birds sit on them and incubate them. DDT made the eggshells thinner. So when the birds sat on them, the eggshell broke and there were no young produced. The population declined.
Some bird populations declined more than others. They were more sensitive to DDT's harmful effects.
The birds that were affected most by DDT were the ones at the top of the food chain. Herring gulls and some of the other fish-eating birds, cormorants, brown pelicans, some of the raptors, peregrine falcon in particular. And birds weren't affected equally. Some are much more sensitive than others. The peregrine is very, very sensitive. The double-crested cormorant is quite sensitive. The herring gull is very sensitive. Birds at the top of the food chain were the ones that were most affected.
That's because DDT is what's called a very persistent chemical. It hangs around in the environment for a long time. For instance, DDT may persist in water for as long as 150 years. It stays in the tissues of all the animals that ingest it. That's why birds at the top of the food chain get a bigger dose. It's called biomagnification and bioaccumulation.
Those are terms that refer to the buildup of compound as you go up the food chain. DDT, for instance, is in the water, goes into small organisms, slightly bigger organisms, and gets up into the top of the food chain. By that time, it's magnified, so it becomes a greater concentration than it was down at the bottom.
Birds weren't the only ones being affected. Mounting evidence of DDT's harmful effects led our government to ban it for most uses in 1969.
It's not nearly as big a problem as it used to be. Back 10 or 15, 20 years ago, it was a much greater problem because there was more in the atmosphere and more in the environment. It's still bioaccumulating and concentrating, but it's not doing as much as it used to. So the values and concentrations are lower now than they used to be. But yes, it's still accumulating.
But the news isn't all bad. The ban on DDT has had an effect.
Oh, I think there's lots of cause for optimism. I mean, things are not nearly as bad as they used to be, and they're getting better all the time. We have a program going where we've been measuring chemicals in herring gull eggs for 25 years, and the levels are much, much less than they used to be. They're about 10% of what they were 25 years ago. So they've declined about 90%, and that's good. We've made big strides, but we've got a little bit left to go. Eventually, we'd like to get to absolutely no chemicals in these birds, and so there's a ways to go. We have to keep working to keep the regulations there and to try and get rid of the bit that's left in the environment.
So we can also look at the bioaccumulation of toxic metals as well. And some of the more common ones that you've probably heard of are lead and mercury. And these metals are what we call lipophilic. So now the prefix lipo comes from the word fat, and philic means loving. So if we look at the other word, hydrophobic, if you have a phobia, you usually don't like something or you're scared of something. Philic is the opposite of phobic. So if you're phobic of something, you don't like it. If you're philic of something, you do like it. And lipo, if you think of liposuction, it means fat suction. So lipophilic means fat loving. Hydrophobic means water hating. And these types of metals are lipophilic. In other words, they are able to be in a fat. They are not able to stay in water. So if I'm going to use a vitamin as an example. So certain vitamins, I think like vitamin B, can be stored in your body, or vitamin D. They can get stored in your fat cells. But other vitamins you can't you can't store. So the one that I know about for sure is vitamin C. You cannot store vitamin C. Your body will not keep vitamin C in it. So you always have to keep eating foods that contain vitamin C that helps your immune system. If you eat excess vitamin C, you just release that extra vitamin C in your urine. So it just passes right through you because it is hydrophilic. It likes water. Now, other vitamins that we can store are hydrophobic or lipophilic. They store in water. They'll store in your fats, so you don't have to continuously take them in. If you have excess in your body, you can store it and use it later. So how does that have anything to do with toxic chemicals? Well, if a toxic chemical is lipophilic, meaning it likes fat or it can dissolve in fat, it can get stuck in your fat cells and it accumulates there. If it's hydrophobic, you can probably pass it out through your body, but if it's not, or sorry, if it's hydrophilic, if it will dissolve in water, you can pass it through in your urine. But if it's not, if it likes fat or dissolves in fats, then it will get stored in your body. And so this has happened with mercury. So lots of industry, I know the paper industry was bad for this back in the in the early to mid to late 1900s, I guess. Forestry had some issues as well. All sorts of industries have produced mercury in their processes, and that mercury ended up in our rivers and lakes. And I know in my area where I come from, northwestern Ontario, there was lots of lakes that had high levels of mercury. That mercury got into the fish, and then the indigenous populations that relied on the fish as a resource for their food ended up getting mercury poisoning. Lots of people were getting mercury poisoning because they were eating fish, and it was bioaccumulating in their bodies. So that's one example. Another one is lead. So kind of more hitting close to home in Winnipeg, the St. Boniface area back in the day, in early days of Winnipeg, had lots of industry. And so there's actually high concentrations of lead in the soils in that area of the city right now. And that's because of all the industry that was there. So there's concerns that lead might bioaccumulate into people as they grow plants in their gardens or as kids are playing in the playgrounds and things like that. So here's an example. So if you have a toxic metal, it gets into algae and then it gets into the shrimp. So as you move up the food chain, you can see that the concentration is becoming higher. Same idea in people. Now, if you've seen anything about the Mad Hatter, the reason why he was a little bit kooky was because of mercury poisoning. So back in the 1800s, when these guys were making hats, they would change the fur for like the beaver pelts into felt using mercury. And when the workers were working with the mercury, they were breathing fumes, and those fumes led to toxic mercury getting stored in their fats, and that led to mercury poisoning. And some symptoms of mercury poisoning are shakiness, memory loss of coordination, some slurred speech, anxiety, depression. Just kind of if you think about the character, the Mad Hatter, kind of describes that character. So he was likely suffering from mercury poisoning, which is why they called him the Mad Hatter. And so that would be an example of bioaccumulation in humans and how it can affect people. So again, just to kind of summarize everything, bioaccumulation means accumulating toxins in organisms as you move up the food chain, and it gets higher and higher and higher. The concentration gets higher and higher and higher as you go higher and higher in the food chain.